serving and why did they serve. So the first period goes from the 17th century to around 1770, phasing into 1775, the Boston Massacre and the American Revolution. The second period for me starts in 1783, the ending of the American Revolution, until 1865, the end of the American Civil War. And the third period goes from 1866, and there's another phase in, goes to 1948 to 1952. 48 is when President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the military, and I say on paper, and that's why the phase in comes in, because 1952 is in the midst of the Korean War, and that's when we can almost say that yes, something that forces an executive order to happen happens, and the military has its last segregated unit around 1954. And then the last phase is post-Korean War until the present. And so when you go back to the colonial periods, we'll just leave that aside and jump forward in the interest of time and go to the American Revolution and to the American Civil War, 1865. And for those who are just listening, but for those who can see me, you're seeing in quotations, that was a period where African Americans were legally enslaved by the system. So African Americans during that time, the conditions, they were largely impressed into service. There were free African Americans, some joined. And when they served not only for that patriotic cause, if you will, and some of them weren't getting paid early on, they were serving for freedom. The American Revolution, the colonists were fighting against the British for their freedom against the crown. So why shouldn't their African Americans be fighting for the same cause? And that's why you had African Americans on both sides. And we'll fast forward through the Quasi-War, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, there are conditions there. And then we get to the American Civil War, and it's the same thing. You know, whether you believe the American Civil War started for states' rights or because of slavery, certainly by 1862, with the Militia Acts, and Abraham Lincoln finally deciding that, yes, we are going to raise African Americans. And then you have the United States Colored Troops established in 1863. African Americans are not just fighting for that patriotic cause to win on the battlefield, they're fighting for their freedom and the freedom of their people. And then you get to the end of the Civil War and you have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment come about, the Army Reorganization Act of 1866. And so from 1866, African Americans are now free. And until 1948, they are now fighting in a segregated military. So now the conditions and the causes for them are a little different. Now they have their freedom. They have the 13th Amendment. We're going to see that turn back perhaps in this discussion. The 14th Amendment is turned back. And the 15th Amendment is turned back. So they're fighting for those equalities that they earned from the American Civil War. And then that fourth phase, the conditions are a little different post-Korean War. Now African Americans are more and more beginning to demand their equality, and we get to present day. So really just kind of breaking it down in a nutshell, because I know we only have an hour and I think you have a few more questions. So they served for many reasons, but the conditions were different depending on what period you're looking at.
Okay, that was really helpful. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I've been nerding out and I think I've read almost everything you've written. But really? It was a good refresher for me, and I think for our audience who maybe haven't been stalking you as much. So can you tell us a little bit about like why World War I? Why is World War I considered such a huge transformation for Black men in particular, but particularly for the Black men who were soldiers and fighting abroad? Like what changed, especially knowing now that we've established that Black men really had been serving, and of course Black women do later serve in the military as well.
Okay, so World War I would be in that third period, right in the middle. So we're talking about that 1866 to 1948. So we're talking about African Americans are free. The 13th Amendment has been passed. They're citizens. The 14th Amendment has been passed in 1868. And then the 15th Amendment has been passed in 1870. But when you get to World War I, all of those rights and freedoms and the ability to vote has been taken away from African Americans. And we'll talk about that later on. But what changes? I think I want to use a book I read that came out back in 2005, and a lot of people may have heard it. The World is Flat by New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman. And one of the flatteners in that book, actually the first one, is when the wall came down, talking about the Berlin Wall, the curtain went up.
Right.
And the world opened and people could see. So what changed for African Americans in the military is that now they saw that what they were experiencing, not only them, but their families, what they were experiencing in America, they already knew it wasn't right. But those African Americans who went overseas and they interacted with French men and French soldiers and French women, they found that there was a level of equality. And although those units that served with some of the white units, we imported our Jim Crowism, they found that that wasn't all over the world. But they also found that there were other people who looked like them. They ran into African Senegalese, they ran into West Indies, and they saw that some of these soldiers, their units were actually integrated into the French army. So what changed for them as individuals, and I'll get to the battlefield and the war, is when the wall came down, that curtain went up, their eyes were opening. That was the beginning of what became a transformation, an awakening, a renaissance. But something did change on the battlefield too, and it's good we talked about the sections. So this third phase, 1866 to 1948, by the time you get to World War I, African Americans are not considered the great fighters that they had already proved themselves to be, even in recent years. On the Western frontier, the Army Reorganization Act of 1866, which created the units that became the 9th and the 10th Cavalry, the 24th and the 25th Infantry, Black soldiers, they were awarded 18 medals of honor because of their bravery fighting to this country. 14 African Americans and 4 Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, because you also had Seminole Negro Indian Scouts serving with them. You had 8 sailors. You guys are at the Seaport Museum, who were awarded 8 peacetime medals of honor. And that happened before the criteria changed. And 1 was awarded it twice. And then during the Spanish-American War, you have 6 African Americans who were awarded the Medal of Honor, 5 in the Army and 1 in the Navy. And so in World War I, even though also they did great in the Philippine insurrection, I call it the Philippine War, and on the Mexican border, but in World War I, they were treated as second-class citizens. The regular soldiers were not even deployed. They were draftees and National Guard soldiers by and large. 80% of them were relegated to the SOS type units, which are very important, and only the other 20%, which was 40,000, were put into the infantry. And not one single African American, all the great deeds that they did, was awarded the Medal of Honor. And I know some folks are saying, well, no, that's not correct, because Freddie Stowers was awarded the Medal of Honor, and so was Henry Johnson. But Freddie Stowers was not awarded the Medal of Honor until 1991, and Henry Johnson 2015. So something also changed in America. And this is tongue-in-cheek because everyone is not monolithic. So when I say Black America and I say white America, is not the entire population, but the America that wanted the lost cause to persist realized that when you let a man fight, there will be gains. So when you go back to the American Revolution,
Right.
slavery in northern states ended either immediately and gradually. After the Civil War, it completely ended. And so they also experienced that pushback that, we're not going to allow you to have these heroic deeds on the battlefield.
Thank you for that. And something that I'm going a little rogue here with my questions, so I apologize, but something that you said really kind of stood out to me, right? Because we talk about, and you really just explained that, up until World War I, Black men were receiving the Medal of Honor, and then suddenly they weren't. But we also see, we see like what's happening at Fort Des Moines, and we have Black officers, and we have Black officers like leading on the battlefield. And so you would think that, as like Black men are gaining more and more positions of power, that you would like maybe be able to guess, right, of that would lead to getting more medals of honor, right? And so I think it's like it really is a perfect example of the discrimination that's happening sort of systemically at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if that's a question or a comment, I will tell you right now there is a centennial commission, the Valor Medal Commission, which is now looking at World War I minorities who did a deed where they earned the Distinguished Service Cross as a minimum, and they perhaps should have been awarded the Medal of Honor, and includes Jewish Americans, Asian Pacific Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and African Americans. And right now, I shouldn't say the number because I know it's a little off, but it's in double digits, north of 75 for African Americans that are eligible perhaps for the Medal of Honor. And the reason that's key is that's the only war where that there has not been a redress.
Right.
So for World War II, 20 Nisei Japanese Americans were awarded the Medal of Honor in 2000. 7 African Americans from World War II were awarded the Medal of Honor in 1998. So that's why it's important. And I did a program about 6 weeks ago, and someone asked me, it was a back and forth type of program, why is it important to go back and do that? Shouldn't we be spending more time on awarding people medals now who do a deed? And I said, absolutely, but we also still need to do our best to correct history when we can.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And so I want to jump back for a second to the idea of home, right? That's what we're, exploring here at the Seaport Museum this year. And how do you think that the experiences abroad for these Black men who are fighting, alongside Frenchmen, how did that transform their relationship with home, right? They're fighting in this great war for democracy. It's sort of the first global war for freedom and democracy abroad. And then, thinking about their lives back at home in the United States, like how do you think that relationship was really transformed by that experience?
It emboldened them, and it emboldened the African-American community, because just like today, when a man or a woman serves in the military, his or her family is also serving, whether they go overseas or not. And so 400,000 African Americans served during World War I, and 200,000 of them went overseas. Many had mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers. So I want to add all African Americans into this. But for the veterans, particularly, when they came back, and again, that wall came down and the curtain went up, they were no longer, as a group, willing to accept second-class citizenship and brutality without fighting back. And that's what happens. And so they began to set up their own organizations, and they began to join existing organizations. Right after the war, there was this organization called the American Blood Brothers. And they actually began to plant this seed before they left France. It dissolved, but then they established another organization, the League for Democracy. And what this was, the title says it all. Some of them joined the NAACP, who would not probably have joined the NAACP in 1917, 16, and 15. And depending on their outlook, some joined Marcus Garvey, United Negro Improvement Association. And again, depending on their outlook, some got involved with organizations such as A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owens' Messenger magazine. So they came back determined to get involved in the forward progress of their country. And so that's partly what changed with them. And also, like I said, those around them were also changing.
And so then what happens, right? We've got, really just people around our country, right? Mostly like Black people around our country whose ideas and mindsets are changing. Right? You've got Elaine Locke, right, who's the author of The New Negro, of course, one of my favorite historical Philadelphians, often credited.
Say he's a homeboy, if I could say.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
For you.
Credited as the dean, of course, of the Harlem Renaissance. And he wasn't a soldier, right? But he spent a considerable amount of time abroad. So he was actually in Berlin, up through the 20s. And he returned home right around the same time as most soldiers were returning home from World War I. And according to Jeffrey Stewart, who's, an acclaimed Locke biographer, according to him, the new Negro, right, that, Elaine Locke writes about in his book is a Black person in America who's beaming with self-confidence, with pride, assertiveness, and a lack of deference to white supremacy for the first time. So how do you think the experiences of really like Black soldiers who are abroad and who are coming back, not just emboldened by what's happening culturally with the Harlem Renaissance and what's happening around the United States, but emboldened by, being part of the military themselves and being, representing their country abroad. How do you think that is, ends up influencing the Harlem Renaissance and the future civil rights movement? Do you think it's the other way around? Do you think it was, the ideas that started influencing the Harlem Renaissance that started influencing these soldiers? Or do you think that there actually is a direct connection between the experiences of Black soldiers in World War I and then the later Harlem Renaissance and civil rights movement?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think there is a connection. And so, I when I do programs related to the exhibition, I set up a little home studio. And
Mhm.
so in the studio here is, images. There are images of 9 luminaries, that we interpreted in the exhibition. And so 3 of them helped me tell the story.
Okay.
Behind me, there's an image of a lieutenant named Charles Hamilton Houston. Okay, so a lot of lawyers out there, that name rings a bell immediately, Charles Hamilton Houston. But what a lot of people don't know, and that's him right there, he was a first lieutenant in the United States Army, served in the 368th.
Okay.
He was an artilleryman. He experienced not only the treatment of African American soldiers and officers in World War I, but he also came back and experienced what was called the Red Summer. And I don't know, maybe we'll talk about that later on today. So how does he connect to the civil rights movement and what moves forward? His father was a lawyer. He said he did not want to be a lawyer, but when he came back from the war and because of the way he was treated,
Mhm.
he decided that he was going to go to law school and make sure this didn't happen again. And so to make a long story short, he took different people on throughout the 20s and the 30s to include MacArthur writing a letter about why are they giving Black officer slots to white units.
Mhm.
But the key thing is he is the one who established the modern day Howard Law School.
Right.
And about a little north of 1/3, if not more, of the African American lawyers practicing in America in the late 1930s, 40s, and 50s were trained by who? Charles Hamilton Houston, to include Thurgood Marshall.
Mhm.
And we all know who Thurgood Marshall became, the first
Right.
African American Supreme Court justice. And they became like this in the 40s, defending people across America to include soldiers. But when Charles Hamilton Houston passed away in 1952, 53, 54, Thurgood Marshall said, we would not have gotten anywhere were it not for Charlie. He's talking about Charles Hamilton Houston. They were part of the NAACP Defense Fund. And we hear these stories always about Thurgood Marshall, but we don't hear a lot about Charles Hamilton Houston. Another person behind me is this guy right here. That's A. Philip Randolph.
Mm-hmm.
And some people say, yes, he's that elderly gentleman sitting next to Martin Luther King on August 28, 1963. He's the grandfather of the March on Washington. Some people know he's the one that can be credited for Executive Order 8802 in 1941 that FDR passed because he threatened the first March on Washington. But the reason he's up here for World War I, he's 28 years old on that picture. He is the young 28-year-old man when I talk about this younger generation. And that's why I was so happy when we initially talked and you decided that, yeah, this is a program you wanted to put on. He is the young 28-year-old man with his partner who established that radical communist magazine called The Messenger. He's the one that when President Wilson said, we must fight to make the world safe for democracy, and he wrote in the magazine, we would rather make Georgia safe for the Negro. Georgia being a metaphor for the world, and the Negro being African Americans. And so there's a direct connection from World War I, and he was fired up with all that was going on in that period, and he stayed true to the cause, and he was there in 1963. And the person you can't see me right behind, that's, you probably can't see it because of the light, that's Josephine Baker.
Right.
I won't tell her story. A lot of people know that Josephine Baker was from East St. Louis. She experienced the one of the worst race riots as an 11-year-old daughter in 11-year-old girl in 1917. And then, of course, she makes the statement, as a Black person, I was afraid to live in my own country. That's why she went to France and became an international star. Right. She was the only woman that spoke in 1963. And some of these others have that connection. So what I say is that the World War I generation certainly planted seeds that were watered in the 1930s and in 1940s, and they germinated, and it was the World War II generation who executed the civil rights movement. But yeah, there is certainly a connection in my mind.
Absolutely, yeah, that's the thing that really, when I was reading through your work, like that's what jumped out at me most, right? Is this, you can imagine a connection, but then when you actually break it down in the way that you just did, it's like, yes, of course, like here is the seed. And it's, without World War I, would that seed have ever been there? And I'm sure it would have come at a different time and it would have happened in a different way. Absolutely. Right. But, to not acknowledge that, I think now is a piece of history that a lot of us are missing. And so I'm really, I'm encouraged by the work that you're doing. And that's why I feel particularly honored to be having this conversation with you today.
Well, I will add to that what you were saying, so when is there a beginning and when is there an end? I mean, we can always argue when was the seed planted. And you can say it was planted right after the American Civil War.
Right.
And so I say that to say this, because I've given a presentation and talked about the era of Reconstruction. We as historians, we say Reconstruction ended in 1877.
Right.
But in my mind, I don't think I think we are still reconstructing this country, because the compromise that officially ended Reconstruction really opened up the void, and the country never got a chance to reconstruct. And so did Reconstruction ever end, or are we still in Reconstruction? Were the seeds planted before World War I? Perhaps, but there's no doubt about it that the majority of them were planted because of the experience of African Americans writ large, not just soldiers in World War I, and what they experienced immediately after they came back to the war, the Red Summer.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I was actually just going to ask you, you mentioned the Red Summer, and I want to jump back to that. Can you tell us a little bit more about, what it is and what happened, and what it really has to do with World War I in particular?
Okay, so yeah, the Red Summer happened in 1919, and for those of us who like seasons and they're 3 months, it was really about a 7-month period. The Red Summer is a 7-month period of 1919, roughly in April, going to October, where the nation just erupted in race riots. Almost 40 race riots in small, medium, and large cities, about 53 separate lynchings of African Americans. And we document that there are also 13 of them were veterans during that period. And there were certainly African American veterans who were lynched outside of the Red Summer window. And the difference in these riots is African Americans fought back. We talk about that enlightenment, being emboldened.
Right.
And so maybe I'll come back and tell a story or two about some of those, but I'll tell you also, the more and more I go back and look at the research we were doing for the exhibition and some of the writings, I no longer just pin it on World War I. And this is the story I'll tell you now. The 13th Amendment was freed African Americans in 1865. We talked about that. That was slowly taken away from African Americans in different ways. In slavery, there were slave codes. They became black codes after the war, where African Americans and mainly men were unfairly targeted or put into a bondage system. And for many reasons, something they never did, they stayed in for years. So another name for slavery. 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed, equality as a citizen. Well, number one, after the 1875 Civil Rights Act, then you have the civil rights cases at the Supreme Court level of 1883, vote 8-1, that really took away a lot of those freedoms in travel, lodging, recreation that African Americans can do. So that was stripped away from African Americans. And then you talk about the 15th Amendment in 1870, African American men having the right to vote. That was taken away in many ways.
Right.
You had poll tax, you had literacy tests, you had the Grandfather Act, and then you had old-fashioned intimidation.
Right.
And then we can talk about quotes that come from Ida B. Wells and Jane Addams, that a lot of us know from Hull House, and a 1931 Nobel Peace Prize recipient who talks about the horrors of lynching. And that goes to the fact that we're not monolithic. You know, this was really not an all white and a black issue. You know, African Americans along the way had their white allies. And then we can talk about the Atlanta riot of 1906, which made international news. We can talk about the 1908 riot in the political birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, Springfield, Illinois.
Right.
We don't necessarily even have to talk about East St. Louis. And then African Americans heard their president say, "We must fight to make the world safe for democracy."
Right.
And so those who chose to believe that, because remember what A. Philip Randolph said, but there are people like W.E.B. Du Bois right there, you know, who says, put your grievances aside. So when African Americans come back from the war, it's not just that wall that came down and the curtain that came open because of what they heard. And the more and more, and you know, we all go back and we read some of the things that we do, and then we want to edit and, you know, maybe do a second edition on something. I'm convinced that the Red Summer was not just that pent up energy from the last 2 years of participating in the war. When Wilson said, and I thought about this right after we talked about 6 weeks ago, and I was thinking, okay, yeah, I think I'll do this presentation, because, you know, we went kind of back and forth, because I was trying to, you know, really struggle with really talking about some contentious issues. But I thought about the fact that when Wilson said, we must fight to make the world safe for democracy. I think a lot of those folks thought about the 13th, the 14th,
Right.
and the 15th Amendment. I haven't put that on paper anywhere, but I think that was also a part of it. It wasn't just being emboldened during the war.
Right, but also
And so, yeah, so
remembering.
the two stories. So just to give you, and I give you one, I don't know how much time we have. So
Oh,
you can tell
we've
the
got some time.
DC or the Chicago. So we'll do the DC story. So up close to those 40, 60. So Washington, DC was one of those places in the summer of 1919.
Mhm.
And most of them starts off with a rumor. And this
Right.
rumor was a black soldier accosted a white woman who had happened to be the wife of a veteran
Mhm.
Air Corps soldier. Um, and but previous to that, there were other writings in the paper of African Americans, being rude or maybe accosting some of the white women. And so they caught this man. They put him in jail. There was no evidence. They let him out the Sunday morning.
Mhm.
To make a long story short, in DC, like it is today, had a lot of returning veterans, a lot of units. So there were sailors, soldiers, and Marines with the civilians, and they just went around rioting into black neighborhoods
Mhm.
and injuring African Americans, and a few were killed. And Carter G. Woodson witnessed one,
Right.
the father of Black History Week, now month. Um, African Americans tried to work with the authorities, tried to get an audience with Wilson, the Secretary of State. No one would do anything. On Monday, well, and I'm paraphrasing, if you're not going to help us, we're going to help ourselves.
Right.
So for the next day and a half, African Americans got their weapons out, protected their neighborhoods, and
Mhm.
they also did what was back then called terror drives or something like drive-by shootings, and they went on the offense. And so this riot just petered out mainly because of exhaustion.
Right.
And at the end, there were 4 African American dead and
Mhm.
3 white dead.
Mhm.
You weren't seeing that before
Right.
World War One.
Right.
And in Chicago was even worse. It was in 2 phases. And when it was over, and we can tell the story about how African Americans finally armed themselves, it was 23 African Americans dead
Mhm.
and 15 white dead.
Right.
And so that was the difference in the Red Summer, because what happened is some white Americans had decided
Mhm.
that they were going to put this genie, the African American community, back in their place
Right.
because they were used to seeing how that worked. But as we talked about before, African Americans had decided
Mhm.
that they were going to fight back. And
Right.
that is the difference in the Red Summer. And that's why it was a turning point. It didn't solve everything, of course, because we still have Tulsa in 1921, we have Rosewood in 1923, and we still have lynchings going on.
Mhm.
But it was less, it wasn't the same after 1919.
Right.
There was caution in some communities about going into African American communities and just having your way with the community if you didn't like what happened.
So what really stands out to me is that we've got, 1919 is a huge year for a lot of reasons, right? But really the parallels between 1919 and our past year 2020 um, are kind of shocking when you look at them on paper, right? So we have the Red Summer, we've got African Americans. Of course, we have up until that point, our entire history, our colonial history in the United States is one of white supremacy and terror, right? But we've got African Americans fighting back, literally like arming themselves and fighting back,
Mhm.
in an organized way for the first time. But we're also battling a worldwide pandemic, right?
Mhm.
The Spanish flu is sort of wiping everybody out around the world. And of course, in 2020, we see, the COVID-19 pandemic. That's why we're on Zoom now. But we
Right.
also see an eruption of protests against police brutality and white supremacy after the murder of George Floyd. And of course, these are not the first protests, right, against police brutality or against white supremacy in the United States, but they're really, for the first time in a few decades, the most regular and the most widely discussed on the news. So as a historian, what's happening there? Like, is this history repeating itself? Is this, because Reconstruction never ended, like what's going on, and why is 1919 so similar to 2020, 100 years later?
Okay, yeah, I think the way I look at that is I certainly believe, yes, history does repeat itself, but I don't think it repeats itself in a linear way or in an apples to apple way. It repeats itself relative, if I can, use that word. 1919 was 1919, 2020 was 2020. So I'll try to tell this in a quick way. So 1991, we had Rodney King on TV.
Right.
Every officer was acquitted.
Right.
So 1991, Rodney King, that could be the civil rights cases of 1883.
Right.
Fast forward about 20 years, Trayvon Martin, 11, 12, 13, stand your ground law in Florida. The guy had iced tea and Skittles.
Right.
So that could be East St. Louis or Springfield riot. So what could be our red summer? And again, not apple to apples, not linear.
Right.
Today is 23 February.
Right.
And this hit me last night. This is the 1 year. I think there are 3 that could be our red summer. This is the 1 year anniversary of Ahmaud Arbery.
It is.
This is the 1 year anniversary today.
Yes.
Less than a month later, then we have Breonna Taylor.
Right.
And almost 2 months later is when we see George Floyd in real life over and over and over.
Right.
The wall came down, the curtain went up.
Right.
And so that is the non-apples to apples red summer. And so just like back in 1919, if you read some of these accounts, and I've read just about all of them, again, it's not monolithic. And a lot of these, there were white allies that African Americans could go to for shelter and depend on. And so you fast forward that today in the protests. A lot of these protests, they're not majority African American. They're Americans.
Right.
And so, yeah, history repeats itself, but I'm always careful as a historian to not draw a direct parallel. And I hope that answers your question.
It absolutely does. Yeah, I appreciate that. I feel similarly, that of course, things and themes in history repeat, especially as we don't have these difficult conversations and we don't work to resolve conflict, right? And really systemic issues that we've built into the structure of our society. Things and themes will pop up from that, but I think we're in attempting to tell that story quickly, right? That sometimes we're quick to sort of simplify the narrative too much. And so I appreciate that that's not something.
Well, you said 2 things there that I want to continue to add on. So I think your word is better, the themes, but also you said move on and we don't solve conflicts. And so, I don't think we solved the reconstruction of the country, and we didn't solve everything, even though African Americans began to fight back more after the Red Summer. That's why we are still having these difficult moments today. And what I think we have to do as individuals is, start really trying to reach out and connect with people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, and really create a bond, not just this cursory bond. Okay, we're going to meet every month at this conference or at this discussion session, but really create a bond and also start having tearing down the walls of those inequalities that we face. So you mentioned COVID, and I was thinking about this too, because I know we didn't say we were going to dive deep into this. But the inequalities And because many African Americans and minorities we've seen work in those jobs
Mhm.
where they have to be out in the public. And because of their pay, maybe they're living somewhere where there could be a food desert
Mhm.
or this environmental waste zone,
Mhm.
which was happening back in the 1910s.
Of
And then
course.
also, what healthcare can you afford? And so, if we continue to create this ability where everyone doesn't have the opportunity to move forward based on their skill sets
Mhm.
or have the opportunity to create skill sets, um, you know, the theme of history repeating itself. And I wrote something in a book that I that it was published in 1914, and the editors kind of toned it down, and it was about fault lines because I said it back then, you know, that fault lines are developing in this country
Mhm.
that could erupt. And so unless we fix things, the fault lines are going to be there.
Right.
And just like an earthquake, they're going to erupt. Earthquake is nature. Only God can fix that. You know, we as human beings, you know, we can fix some of these fault lines in our society if we make an effort.
Absolutely, yeah. Something that I've had the privilege of doing, for the past almost year now is working with our teen program, our River Ambassadors, and something we talk to them about a lot is environmental justice, right? But you can't talk about environmental justice without talking about environmental racism, and you can't talk about environmental racism without looking at the history of really structural inequality in our United States, and something that happens almost always is they get incredibly discouraged at first, right? Because you see things and you experience things and you're living your life. And then when you see, the history of structural inequality in our country, it can be intimidating, especially if you're 15. Really, if you're any age, but particularly when you're 15. But then they always leave encouraged, right? Because one of the things that we really empower them to think about is that it's people, right, that create our society, and it's people that create all of the laws that govern us, whether they're written laws or they're just our practices.
Right.
And so it's people that can change them. And so I really do, I hear and I appreciate what you're saying, because I feel incredibly similarly, right? And that's kind of the guiding reason that we're doing this programming this year. And that being said, I just realized we have 10 minutes left, so I want to be,
Okay.
respectful of your time, and we do have a couple of questions from the audience, so I'm going to jump right to those. One of them you touched on a little bit, but one of your high school college buddies has a question for you, and they want you to talk a little bit about how African Americans felt about joining the military in light of how World War I vets were treated after returning home to the United States after the war.
How they felt about joining the military in World War One, and there was a second part to the question.
Yeah, so how, in light of how veterans were treated after returning to the United States after World War I, how did that impact how African Americans felt about joining the military? I think after that.
After World War One.
After World War
Yeah. Again, that, well, what I found as a historian and a lot of reading is, and I say this all the time, African Americans are not now, and they never have been monolithic. So without a doubt, there were African Americans who wanted to have nothing to do with the military,
Right.
and some wanted to have very little to do with America. We didn't get to talk about Paris Noir and those African Americans who either never came back to the United States because they knew what they might be coming back to,
Right.
or those who came back to the United States and went overseas almost immediately after they got back.
Mm-hmm.
But then there were some who remained patriotic to their country because they felt, my country, right or wrong, my country. And so, as I say that, that reminds me of a story of an artifact I collected right here in the Chicago area when I was working on the exhibition with the Smithsonian of World War One. A guy named Charles Blackwood. He was a young African-American man, a college graduate of 1915. Make a long story short, he got into Fort Des Moines. He was an officer in the 365th Regiment of the 92nd Infantry Division, won 3 battle stars or were awarded 3 battle stars. He came back and he fought and clawed his way to stay in some of those few slots in the National Guard Reserve Service. And he was successful to the point that he was an officer in World War II,
Wow.
a major and lieutenant colonel. He was stationed at Fort Huachuca. He retired in 1948. So again, that's not just a straight down the middle answer. There were some that wanted to have nothing to do with the military, and some that were still wanting to serve. And to include Charles Young. Charles Young, one of my heroes, is right there. You know, he was treated very badly during that era, I would say. Stayed in, went back overseas, even with his bad health, and they wouldn't let him go to World War I, and he died in Africa.
Wow.
And now he's back in Arlington Cemetery. I think one of only 4 individuals that had like the state funeral there, actually.
Wow. Actually, speaking of Arlington, that actually ties really nicely into our next question. Of course, Arlington National Cemetery is home of the unknown soldier for World War I. And a question from Craig, our chief curator, actually, is in your research for your exhibition, did you find any contemporary viewpoints from African Americans of the unknown soldier for World War I? Were there any personal letters or such kinds of materials that kind of capture those views?
I have not come across any research related to how African Americans felt or about the unknown soldier.
Okay, we'll keep looking. We'll let you know.
I think your program 2 or 3 down the road is the president of the Unknown Soldier Society, right? To talk about that difficult journey. So
yes, yeah.
He'll know that answer, maybe. I don't know.
Hopefully we will. I don't know if Gavin's here with us, but Gavin, if you're listening, I'll send you the recording. Otherwise, we all want to know. All right, one more question from the audience. You touched on this a little bit, but do you want to tell us more about veteran groups that African American soldiers formed, particularly for themselves, sort of in the style of the VFW, or the Legion? Mm-hmm. Were there any that were exclusive to Black veterans or Black soldiers?
Yeah, so a 2-part answer. So really, just briefly, the American Blood Brothers and the League of Democracies no longer exist. They were not official government sanctioned organizations. So the African Americans established those. The American Blood Brothers actually dissolved shortly after the war, and the seed was planted overseas. The League for Democracy stayed around for several years, and those guys were activists within their communities, and they also joined, like I said, they would get involved in the NAACP or the Messenger magazine or the United Negro Improvement Association. But the key thing is the VFW, the American Legion, I want to say. The American Legion was born out of World War I.
Right.
And because of our segregated society, there were American Legion posts. As a matter of fact, in the exhibition we did, we had I think it was like 70 some odd American Legion posts that were established between 1920, 21, the same year it started, and we ended in 1940. And they were named generally for African Americans. Right. Matter of fact, one of the artifacts we had was the green Copeland American Legion post, founded in Charlestown, West Virginia, and talk about Renaissance and being woke. Green Copeland were 2 of the 5 African Americans who joined with John Brown at Harper's Ferry.
Right.
And guess where Charlestown, West Virginia is? It's about 3 miles as the crow flies. So they did have their own organizations, but African Americans could establish their American Legion post. And so there were several that were established by African Americans. One James Reese Europe Post, the band leader for the 369th, that was in Washington, D.C. There were several posts named Charles Young that come about in the late 20s, early 30s. So they did participate. As a matter of fact, there was a memorial built in 1928. I forget the city, the only one that when you look at it, it almost compares to some of the other memorials that were built for white World War I veterans. It's either in West Virginia, I forget where it is now, because Soldier Stadium here in Chicago and the World War I Museum in Kansas City were war memorials, and there was one that was built dedicated to African Americans in 1928.
Okay. All right, I've got one final question for you from Norbert Hopkins.
I know Norbert as well. I'm guessing who the other one was. Maybe Harry Ahammer was probably the first question. Yeah.
It was indeed. All right, so Norbert wants to know, you spoke on how many veterans went on the offensive to secure their rights. Do you see any similarity with how the veterans of the past successfully defended their rights with the Black Panthers who stressed independence, including economic independence? Do you want me to read that one again?
Okay, yeah, I think what he's saying is Black veterans that went on the offensive, so maybe he's talking about the Red Summer, went on the offense to protect themselves when they came home, and any parallels to the Black Panthers of the 1960s. And I would say absolutely. I think any organization who establishes themselves for the betterment of their people, I guess assuming it's absolutely, so I think we got it right. There is a parallel. I was trying to think of the number, but there were Vietnam veterans who also came back and joined the Black Panther movement. Now, is there a direct parallel, again, apple to apples? I don't think it's a direct parallel, but yeah, there are definitely some themes there because the Black Panthers actually had a platform. They just weren't out there defending the community. I mean, they were, food and healthcare and education, and had community centers if you dig deep. And I know we're getting over the time. And that's what some of the African American soldiers were getting involved in when they came back from World War I as well.
Thank you. All right, I lied. I have one final question for you, and this is something that I'm asking everyone who participates in any of our programming this whole year. So just considering really all of the intersections of your identity, when you think about home, what does home mean for you?
The United States of America.
Okay.
I mean, when I think about home, I think about the United States of America. I'm an American. I just happen to be African American. I'm an American soldier. I served for 25 years. My father served for 34 years. I have uncles, cousins who served in the military. I'm an American, and I, have had a fairly blessed life. But I will also say that most of us Americans who are minorities, and certainly African Americans, and I'm thinking of this quote that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in The Souls of Black Folk around 1902, 03, 04. It was called Two-ness, our ever-presence, as African Americans. And I said, I think of myself as an American, I'm African American, but we have two souls. And he says we have two thoughts. And he says that we have these unreconciled strivings that we war with and struggle with in our dark skins as Americans. Because although I am an American, I and a lot of minorities, on occasion, I am made aware that I am African American, and there are some individuals who may not necessarily appreciate the inequality. And we can go into stories, but when I think about myself, I think about an American in the United States of America. That's my home.
Thank you for sharing that with me. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate, again, you sharing your time with us tonight. I appreciate, the lens that you're contributing to history. And I just, on behalf of the Seaport Museum, thank you so much for doing this with us. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience while we have them here?
I think my only final thought is a shout out to you guys. I hope I led off your year okay, because I do appreciate this program. When we finally got a chance to talk and you explained that, we want to talk about the difficult subjects to try to, open up conversation. And I looked at your program for the entire year. So I want to applaud you all for, reaching out to individuals to talk about those difficult subjects, and for reaching out to me and inviting me to be with you tonight. So I really enjoyed it.
All right, well, folks, Dr. Salter, it's been a pleasure. Really, it's been my honor, and we appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Okay, and I'll share this recording with you, so you can do whatever you want with it. We're for folks who didn't get the opportunity to join us live, we will be posting this at some point in the next couple of weeks, so people can watch it, when they have time. And if there's ever anything that we can do together again in the future, let me know. I'd be happy to. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great night.
Yeah, you too. Come visit us at Cantigny Park.
Yes, for sure.
All right, take care.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.